cold hit Elena Voss like a wall of stone, and she could no longer feel her own hands. Snow pressed against her face, and the wind screamed through the black trees above her. Somewhere behind her, back through the frozen woods, she could still hear the pack she had trusted her whole life, their voices fading as they walked away and left her to die. She had not done what they said she did. She had told them again and again, on her knees, in the snow, begging them to listen. But the Alpha of Thornwood had already decided her fate before she ever opened her mouth. Her own blood brother had looked at her with eyes that once held warmth and now held nothing but cold judgment. He had turned his back on her and given the order himself. Strip her mark. Leave her in the forest. Let the cold finish what the pack refused to do with their own claws. Elena pressed her palm against the raw skin of her shoulder, where the pack brand had been burned away only an hour before. The pain had faded into a dull throb, but the emptiness left behind felt far worse than any burn. A wolf without a pack was not truly a wolf at all. She was nothing now. No name. No home. No one coming to save her. She tried to call her wolf forward, hoping the shift would bring some warmth, some strength to crawl through the snow, toward anywhere that was not this frozen ground. But her wolf did not answer. It had gone quiet inside her, curled up and broken, as wounded by the betrayal as her human heart. Her sister's face flashed in her mind. Mira, with her sharp smile and her practiced tears, standing before the pack and swearing that Elena had attacked the Alpha's mate in a fit of jealous rage. It was a lie. Every word of it. But lies spoken with enough tears are often louder than the truth spoken with none. Elena's vision blurred. The stars above the treetops began to spin, and for a moment, she thought she saw her mother's face in the swirling snow, though her mother had been gone for 3 winters now. She wondered if this was what dying felt like. A slow drifting away, the cold turning into something almost gentle, almost kind. She did not want to die. Even now, even after everything, some small, stubborn part of her refused to let go. She dug her fingers into the snow and tried to pull herself forward, toward a fallen log that might block some of the wind. Her arms shook with the effort. She managed only a few inches before her strength gave out completely, and she collapsed face first into the white ground. The forest around her had gone eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Elena's eyes fluttered shut. She thought of the years she had spent proving herself to a pack that had never truly seen her. She thought of the elder who had once told her she would lead one day, and how foolish that promise seemed now, buried beneath the truth of her exile. Then the ground began to shake. At first she thought it was her own body trembling from the cold, but the tremor grew steadier, heavier, moving closer with every passing second. Snow shifted around her. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, a low growl rolled through the forest, deep enough that she felt it in her chest before she heard it with her ears. Fear sharpened whatever was left of her senses. A predator. Something massive. Her exiled scent would draw any wolf territory holder within miles, and an unclaimed Omega alone in enemy land was nothing but easy prey. She tried to move again, tried to find any strength left in her limbs, but her body refused to obey. The growling stopped. Footsteps replaced it, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow with a weight that made the ground tremble beneath her cheek. Elena forced her eyes open, though her vision swam and doubled. A massive shape emerged from the darkness between the trees, tall enough to blot out the pale moonlight, its shoulders broad and powerful, its eyes glowing amber in the black night. She had never seen a wolf this large, not even the Thornwood Alpha, who prided himself on his size and strength, came close to the creature now standing over her. This was no ordinary wolf. This was something far more dangerous. Elena tried to speak, to beg, to do anything, but no sound came from her frozen throat. She waited for teeth, for claws, for the end she had already accepted only moments before. Instead, the massive wolf lowered its head and pressed its nose gently against her cheek, testing her scent, testing whether she still breathed. A whimper escaped her before she could stop it. Weakness, vulnerability. Everything a wolf was taught never to show a stranger, especially not one this powerful. But she had nothing left to protect herself with. No pack, no claws, no strength. The wolf shifted. It happened in the space of a single breath, bones and muscle rearranging themselves with a speed and control that spoke of years, maybe centuries. of mastery over the change. Where the massive wolf had stood, now knelt a man, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair dusted by snowflakes, and eyes that had not lost their amber glow even in human form. He wore no shirt despite the cold, his skin seeming to radiate its own heat even in the freezing air. He stared down at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he spoke in a voice low and rough, carrying an authority Elena had never heard from any wolf before, not even her own alpha. "You should not be out here alone," he said. Elena tried to answer, but her lips had gone numb, and only a broken breath escaped her. The man's expression shifted, something like concern flickering across his sharp features. He knelt lower, examining the raw wound on her shoulder, where her pack mark had been burned away, and his jaw tightened. "Someone did this to you," he said, and it was not a question. She managed a small nod, though even that small movement cost her more strength than she had left to give. The man's eyes darkened, a low growl rumbling in his chest, though it was not directed at her. He reached out and gathered her into his arms, as though she weighed nothing at all, pulling her against the warmth of his bare chest, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own body. "I have you now," he said. "You are safe." Elena wanted to ask who he was, wanted to ask why a stranger of such obvious power would trouble himself with an exiled Omega found half dead in the snow. But her body had reached its limit, and the darkness that had been circling the edges of her vision finally closed in completely. The last thing she felt was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek, and the last thing she heard was his voice, quiet but certain, promising her that whoever had done this to her would answer for it. When Elena woke again, it was not to the cold of the forest floor, but to a warmth so complete, it startled her fully awake. She lay wrapped in thick furs, in a bed far larger and softer than anything she had known in Thornwood territory. A fire crackled somewhere nearby, casting flickering shadows across stone walls that told her she was no longer outside, no longer in danger of the cold claiming her life. Panic rose in her chest before memory caught up with confusion. She remembered the snow, she remembered dying, or nearly dying, and the massive wolf that had found her. She remembered strong arms and a voice promising safety. She pushed herself upright too quickly, and pain lanced through her shoulder where the brand had been removed, forcing a gasp from her lips. "You should rest." The voice came from the corner of the room, and Elena's head snapped toward it, her pulse spiking with fear even though exhaustion still weighed heavily on every part of her body. The man from the forest sat in a chair near the fire, though he looked different now, dressed in dark clothing that could not hide the sheer size and strength of him. His amber eyes watched her carefully, as though gauging whether she might bolt from the bed despite her obvious weakness. "Where am I?" Elena managed to ask, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "You are safe," he said again, the same words he had given her in the snow. "This is the Frostmoor stronghold." "My stronghold." Elena's breath caught. Frostmoor was not simply another pack territory. It was a kingdom, ruled not by an ordinary alpha, but by an alpha king, a title so rare that most wolves went their entire lives without ever meeting one, let alone standing in his den. She had heard stories of the Frostmoor king since she was a pup, tales of a ruler whose strength was said to be unmatched among all the northern packs. "You are him," she whispered, "the Alpha King." "Ronan Blackthorn," he said, offering the name with none of the arrogance she might have expected from someone of his rank. "And you are the wolf I found dying in my territory's border woods, left there by wolves who should have protected you." Shame burned through Elena's chest, hot despite the cold that still lingered in her bones. She looked down at her hands, twisted in the fur blanket, unable to meet his gaze. It was one thing to be exiled by her own pack. It was another entirely to have that shame witnessed by a king. "I did not do what they said I did," she said quietly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, desperate suddenly for someone, anyone, to believe her. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the furs entirely. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised her. "I did not ask," he said, "and I do not need to. A wolf who lies does not weep the way you wept in your sleep, calling for a mother who is no longer here to hear you." Elena's cheeks flushed, embarrassed that he had witnessed her most private grief while she slept, defenseless and unaware. But beneath the embarrassment was something else, something warmer, and far more dangerous. No one in Thornwood had ever simply believed her, not without proof, not without demanding she earn their trust first. This stranger, this king, had looked at her once in the snow and decided her word was enough. "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question she had wanted to ask since the moment she opened her eyes. "You do not know me. I am nothing to your kingdom. An exile with no pack has no value to anyone." Something shifted in Ronan's expression, a flicker of an emotion Elena could not quite name, gone as quickly as it appeared. He rose from his chair and moved toward the window, looking out over what she assumed was his territory, his back to her now, broad and unreadable. "I have ruled Frostmoor for a long time," he said. "I have seen wolves die for far less than what was done to you tonight. I have watched packs turn on their own out of fear, out of jealousy, out of nothing more than convenience. I will not pretend I understand every reason a wolf does what they do. But I know cruelty when I see it, and I know innocence when I smell it on the wind, even buried beneath fear and cold." Elena studied his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the tension held tightly in his shoulders, as though the memory of finding her had angered him more than he wanted to show. She did not understand this man, this king who had every reason to leave her in the snow and continue on with his own affairs, and yet had chosen instead to carry her home like something worth saving. "You will stay here," Ronan said, turning back to face her, his tone leaving no room for argument, though something in his eyes softened the command into something closer to an offer. "Until you are healed, until you decide what comes next for you. No one will hurt you again while you are under my protection." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could not simply accept the protection of a king she had known for less than a day, but exhaustion pulled at her once more, and the warmth of the room, the safety of his words, proved too much to fight against. She sank back into the furs, her eyelids growing heavy, despite everything spinning through her mind. As sleep claimed her again, she thought she heard him murmur something low, almost too quiet to catch, words that sounded dangerously close to a vow. "Whoever did this to you will regret it. I promise you that." She did not know, as she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she had known in years, that the promise made in that quiet room would soon reshape the fate of two kingdoms, and that the wolf who found her first in the snow had already begun to feel something inside his chest that no king of Frostmoor had felt in 100 years. Outside, the storm that had nearly killed her continued to rage through the northern woods, but within the walls of the Frostmoor stronghold, for the first time since her exile, Elena Voss finally felt something she thought she had lost forever. She felt safe. Morning came slow over Frostmoor, gray light creeping through the frost-covered window long before Elena stirred again. When she finally opened her eyes, the fire had burned low, and the chair where Ronan had sat through the night stood empty. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed the entire encounter, if the massive wolf and the king with amber eyes had been nothing more than a fevered vision, brought on by the cold. Then she caught his scent, still lingering in the room, wood smoke and pine, and something else entirely his own, and she knew it had all been real. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened, and a young woman stepped inside carrying a tray of steaming broth and warm bread. She had kind eyes and dark curls pulled back from her face, and she smiled gently when she saw Elena awake and watching her. "My name is Wren," the woman said, setting the tray down carefully beside the bed. "I am the healer here. The king asked me to look after you while you recover." Elena studied her for a moment, searching for any hint of judgment, any flicker of the disgust she had grown used to seeing in the eyes of her former pack. She found none. Wren's expression held only quiet warmth, the kind Elena had almost forgotten wolves were capable of showing a stranger. "Thank you," Elena said softly, unused to such simple kindness after everything she had endured. Wren helped her sit up carefully, mindful of the wound on her shoulder, and began cleaning and wrapping it with practiced hands. As she worked, she spoke in an easy, unhurried voice, filling the quiet room with small stories about the stronghold, about the kitchens below and the training grounds beyond the eastern wall, about a kingdom that sounded nothing like the rigid, fear-driven pack Elena had grown up inside. "You are fortunate," Wren said eventually, tying off the last of the bandage. "The king rarely leaves the stronghold to patrol the border himself anymore. If he had not been there last night, in that particular stretch of forest, at that particular hour, I do not think you would have survived until morning." Elena's throat tightened at the truth in those words. She thought of the moment she had accepted her death, curled in the snow with no strength left to fight for another breath. She thought of the low growl that had rolled through the trees, and the massive wolf that had appeared like something out of an old story, told to frightened pups before bed. "Does he do that often?" Elena asked. "Patrol himself, I mean." Wren's expression shifted, something thoughtful crossing her face before she answered carefully. "Not in a long time," she said. "Not since before I came to serve here. But last night, something drew him out into the storm. I have never seen him return carrying anyone before." The words settled strangely in Elena's chest, warm and unsettling all at once. She did not know what to make of a king who broke years of habit on the very night she needed saving most. She told herself it was simply chance, simply timing, nothing more than the kind of coincidence that made for good stories told around a fire. But some quiet part of her, the same part that had refused to let go and die in the snow, wondered if it had been something more. Days passed slowly inside the Frostmoor stronghold, each one bringing a little more strength back into Elena's limbs, and a little more color back into her pale cheeks. She spent her mornings resting beneath thick firs, while Wren checked her wound, and her afternoons sitting near the tall windows, watching wolves train in the yard below, their movements sharp and disciplined in a way that reminded her painfully of a life she no longer had. Ronan visited every evening without fail. He never stayed long, never overstepped the careful distance he seemed determined to keep between them, but he always came, always asked how she was healing, always lingered a few moments longer than necessary before excusing himself. Elena found herself waiting for those visits more than she wanted to admit. It was during one such evening, nearly 2 weeks after he had carried her out of the snow, that she finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building inside her since the moment she understood exactly who he was. "Your advisors do not approve of me being here," she said, watching his face carefully for any reaction. "I have heard them talking in the halls. They do not understand why their king troubles himself with an exile." Ronan's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm when he answered. "My advisors offer counsel. They do not make decisions for me. But they are not wrong to wonder," Elena pressed, unable to stop herself. "I have no pack, no name that means anything beyond the shame attached to it. I am a burden on your kingdom, and you have not even asked me why I was exiled in the first place." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those amber eyes that seemed to see far more than she wanted him to. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that settled something restless inside her chest. "I told you once already," he said. "I do not need to ask, but if you wish to tell me, I will listen. Every word." Elena's hands twisted in the blanket across her lap, old grief and old anger rising together, in a tangle she had never fully untied, not even for herself. She had spent weeks running the same memories over and over, searching for some detail she had missed, some way she could have changed the outcome. But sitting here, in this warm room, with a king who had chosen to believe her before she ever explained herself, she finally found the strength to speak the truth aloud. "I have a sister," Elena began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt beneath her ribs. "Mira. We were close once, when we were young, but she always wanted what I had, even when I had very little to give. When our pack elder began teaching me the old ways of leadership, when he told others he believed I might one day guide the pack forward, something changed in her. I saw it happen, slowly, over years. The way she looked at me stopped being warm." Ronan said nothing, but his silence was not empty. It was the silence of someone listening completely, giving her every bit of space she needed to continue. 3 months ago, Elena went on, the Alpha's mate was attacked in the eastern woods. Someone struck her from behind and left her bleeding near the river. She survived, but she could not identify who had done it. Mira came forward the very next day, weeping before the entire pack, swearing she had seen me near the river that same night, swearing I had confessed my jealousy to her in private, that I wanted the Alpha's mate gone so that I might rise in her place. "It was a lie," Ronan said quietly, not a question this time but a simple statement of fact. "Every word of it," Elena confirmed, her eyes burning with the effort of holding back tears she refused to let fall in front of him. "I was nowhere near the river that night. I was with our pack elder, learning the histories he wanted passed down before he grew too old to remember them himself. But he had already fallen ill by the time the accusations came, too weak to speak in my defense, and no one believed me over my own sister's tears. "And your alpha?" Ronan asked, his voice carrying an edge now, sharp beneath its calm. "He did not investigate before ordering your exile." "He did not need to," Elena said bitterly. "Mira is his mate's closest companion. Her word carried more weight than mine ever could, especially once fear took hold of the pack. No one wanted to be seen defending a wolf accused of attacking the alpha's own mate, whether they believed the accusation or not." Ronan rose from his chair, moving to stand near the window, his shoulders rigid with a tension Elena had not seen from him before. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped low, carrying a quiet fury that made the hair on her arms rise despite the warmth of the fire. "A pack that abandons truth for convenience is no pack worth belonging to," he said. "You are fortunate to be free of them, whatever the cost of that freedom has been." Elena studied his profile in the firelight, the tight line of his jaw, the way his hands had curled into loose fists at his sides. She had expected many reactions to her story. Pity, perhaps. Polite sympathy that masked quiet doubt. She had not expected anger on her behalf. Anger that seemed to burn as hot as her own had once burned, before exhaustion and cold had smothered it beneath the snow. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked softly. "I am still a stranger to you, my king. Whatever happened to me in Thornwood territory is not your burden to carry." Ronan turned back to face her, and something in his expression made her breath catch, though she could not name exactly what she saw there. It was not pity. It was not simple curiosity. It looked, if she allowed herself to consider it honestly, dangerously close to something far deeper. "Perhaps it should not matter as much as it does," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain in a way she suspected was rare for him. "But it does. I cannot explain it fully. Not yet. I only know that when I found you in that snow, something in me refused to simply walk away and leave the matter to chance." The room fell silent between them, filled only with the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of wind against the stone walls. Elena did not know what to say to a confession like that, offered so plainly by a king who had every reason to guard his words far more carefully. She only knew that her heart, still healing from betrayal and cold and loss, had begun to beat a little faster in his presence, and that frightened her nearly as much as the storm that had almost killed her. The following morning, Elena finally left her bed for longer than a short walk to the window. Ren declared her strong enough to move about the stronghold under careful supervision, and Elena found herself grateful beyond words for the simple freedom of walking on her own 2 feet through unfamiliar halls. She had not gone far before she encountered a tall wolf with graying hair and sharp, assessing eyes, standing near the entrance to what appeared to be a council chamber. He studied her with open scrutiny as she approached, making no effort to hide his suspicion. "You must be the exile the king brought home," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes were anything but. "I am Callum. I have served as advisor to the Frostmoor throne for over 20 years. Elena straightened her spine, refusing to let his obvious doubt shrink her the way Thornwood's judgment once had. "Elena Voss," she said simply, "though I understand my presence here has caused some concern among the king's council." Callum's expression did not soften, but something in his posture shifted slightly, as though her direct honesty had surprised him. "The king has never before brought a stranger into these walls without explanation," he said. "Frostmoor's strength depends on careful alliances and careful decisions. An unclaimed wolf with an uncertain past complicates both." "I understand your concern," Elena said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the way her pulse raced beneath her calm exterior. "I did not ask to be brought here. I only wished to survive the night I was left to die. Whatever happens next is not entirely within my control, but I promise you, I mean no harm to this kingdom, or its king." Callum studied her for a long moment, and something like grudging respect flickered briefly across his weathered features before he inclined his head slightly and continued on his way without further comment. Elena released a breath she had not realized she was holding, watching his retreating figure disappear down the corridor. She did not know yet how deeply her presence would reshape the kingdom around her, or how quickly the quiet warmth building between herself and the Alpha King would draw attention from far more dangerous corners than a single skeptical advisor. But standing there in the stone hallway, stronger than she had been in weeks, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since her exile, to imagine a future that did not end in the cold. That afternoon, drawn by curiosity and a restless energy she had not felt since long before her exile, Elena made her way toward the training yard she had watched so often from her window. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but it no longer felt like an enemy the way it had in the forest. Here, surrounded by the tall stone walls of Frostmoor, the cold felt clean, almost welcoming. A group of young wolves sparred near the center of the yard, their movements quick and controlled under the watchful eye of an older warrior with a scarred jaw and steady hands. Elena stood near the fence, watching with an interest she could not quite hide, until the warrior noticed her presence and called out. "You look like you know how to fight," he said, studying her with open curiosity, rather than the suspicion she had grown used to expecting from strangers. "Care to prove it?" Elena hesitated only a moment before nodding. She had spent years training in Thornwood, working twice as hard as anyone else, simply to be taken seriously as an Omega, with ambitions beyond her rank. She had not forgotten a single lesson, even if her pack had chosen to forget everything she had once been. The warrior, who introduced himself simply as Finn, paired her against one of his strongest trainees, a broad-shouldered young wolf who clearly expected an easy match against the thin, still recovering exile standing before him. Elena said nothing, only settled into a familiar stance, waiting. The match did not last long. Whatever strength the young wolf had in size, Elena matched with speed and precision, years of discipline guiding every movement, even through the lingering weakness in her limbs. When she finally swept his legs out from under him and pinned him firmly to the packed snow, a stunned silence fell over the gathered trainees, quickly followed by low murmurs of surprise and grudging respect. Finn crossed his arms, studying her with new interest. "Not bad," he said, "for someone who was half dead in the snow 2 weeks ago." Elena allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the first genuine smile she had felt in longer than she could remember. "I had good teachers," she said simply, choosing not to mention how hard she had fought for every scrap of that teaching, how much she had needed to prove herself worthy of lessons others received freely, simply for being born into the right rank. She did not notice, at first, the figure standing near the far edge of the yard, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. When she finally turned and caught sight of Ronan leaning against the stone archway, arms crossed, expression unreadable, her heart gave an unexpected lurch. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, brushing snow from her sleeves as she approached him. "Long enough," Ronan said, and there was something warm beneath the simple words, something that made her stomach flutter in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "You fight well." "I had to," Elena said honestly. "In Thornwood, no one handed an Omega respect. You earned it, or you went without." Ronan's expression darkened slightly at that, though he said nothing further on the matter, simply falling into step beside her, as she made her way back toward the stronghold's entrance. The silence between them was comfortable rather than heavy, filled with the kind of easy companionship Elena had not realized she missed until she found it again. "You are stronger than you believe yourself to be," Ronan said eventually, his voice quiet but certain. "I hope you come to see that as clearly as everyone else in that yard just did." Elena glanced up at him, surprised by the simple sincerity in his words, and found herself, for the first time in weeks, thinking less about the pack that had cast her aside, and more about the strange, unexpected warmth she felt whenever this particular king chose to stand beside her. As winter deepened around the Frostmoor stronghold, Elena's days took on a new rhythm, one built not around fear and survival, but around small, unfamiliar comforts. She trained in the mornings, with Finn and the other warriors, her strength returning fully with each passing week, until she could hold her own against wolves twice her size. In the afternoons, she wandered the stronghold's many halls, slowly learning the layout of a home that had begun, quietly and without her fully realizing it, to feel less like a temporary shelter, and more like somewhere she belonged. But it was the evenings she found herself looking forward to most, the quiet hours when Ronan would seek her out, sometimes in the great hall over a shared meal, sometimes in the smaller study near his private chambers, where a fire always burned warm against the cold. Their conversations had grown easier with time, less guarded, filled with the kind of honesty two people rarely offered strangers but somehow found natural to offer each other. One such evening, as snow fell heavily against the windows, and the fire crackled low in the grate, Elena found herself studying Ronan's face across the small table between them, noting the faint lines of exhaustion she had not seen so clearly before. "You carry more weight than you let on," she said quietly, setting down her cup. "Being king must be heavier than the stories make it sound." Ronan's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, tired and honest in a way that surprised her. "Frostmore has stood strong for 3 generations under my family's rule," he said. "My father built alliances across half the northern territories before his death. My mother held the kingdom steady through 2 wars, before I was ever old enough to fight in them myself. I inherited a legacy I am still not certain I deserve to carry." "You have carried it well enough to become a king other wolves speak of with fear and respect in equal measure," Elena said. "That is no small thing." "Fear is easy to earn," Ronan said, his voice dropping lower, more thoughtful than she had heard from him before. "Respect that is real, the kind that does not vanish the moment convenience demands it, that is far harder to build. I have spent years trying to be certain my people follow me, because they trust me, not simply because they fear what happens if they do not." Elena thought of her own pack, of how quickly respect built over years had crumbled the moment fear and convenience demanded her sacrifice instead. She understood, more deeply than she wished she did, exactly what Ronan meant. "That is why you believed me so easily," she said slowly, realization dawning. "Not because you are careless with your trust, but because you have spent your whole life learning to see past fear to whatever truth lies beneath it." Something shifted in Ronan's expression, surprise mixed with something warmer, something that made Elena's pulse quicken despite herself. "Perhaps," he admitted, "or perhaps I simply recognized something in you I did not expect to find in a stranger, pulled half-frozen from the snow." "And what was that?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, the space between them feeling suddenly smaller than it had moments before. "Strength," Ronan said simply. "Not the kind that comes from size or claws, but the kind that survives betrayal and cold and loss, and still finds the will to keep breathing, to keep fighting, even when every reason to give up would have been forgiven. I do not meet wolves like that often, Elena. Not in my court. Not anywhere." Elena's breath caught at the quiet sincerity in his words, at the way he said her name like it meant something important to him. She had spent so many years being told, in ways large and small, that she was less than she should be, less useful, less valuable, less worthy of a pack's protection. To sit here now, across from a king who spoke of her strength as though it were something rare and precious, felt almost too foreign to trust completely. "I do not know how to be anything other than what I am," she admitted honestly, even when it would have been easier to simply give up. "That is precisely why it matters," Ronan said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it hummed with something unspoken between them, something neither seemed quite ready to name aloud. Elena studied the firelight dancing across his features, the strong lines of his face softened for once by something other than the weight of leadership, and felt her heart do something dangerously close to reaching toward him. It was Ronan who finally broke the silence, rising from his chair and moving to add another log to the fire, though the flames hardly needed it. When he spoke again, his voice had regained some of its careful composure, though warmth still lingered beneath the words. "You should rest," he said. "Finn tells me you pushed yourself hard again today in the training yard." Elena allowed a small smile, grateful for the gentle shift back toward easier ground, even as some part of her wished he had said something else entirely. "I am stronger every day," she said. "Soon I will have no excuse left to linger here as a burden on your kingdom." Ronan turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes stole whatever teasing reply she had been preparing to offer. "You are no burden, Elena," he said, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. "I hope, in time, you come to understand that as clearly as I already do." She did not have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to speak aloud, without revealing far more than she was ready to admit, even to herself. She simply nodded, rising from her own chair, and made her way toward the door, aware the entire time of his gaze following her, warm and steady, until she disappeared into the hall beyond. That night, lying beneath the thick furs of her borrowed bed, Elena found sleep slow to come, her mind turning over every word Ronan had spoken, every look that had passed between them in the firelight. She thought of Thornwood, of the pack that had thrown her away without a second thought, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the memory no longer carried the same crushing weight it once had. Something new had begun to take root in its place, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. She did not yet have a name for what she felt growing inside her chest whenever Ronan was near, but she suspected, lying awake in the dark stronghold that had somehow become the safest place she had ever known, that she would not be able to deny it much longer. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat across the northern sky, leaving behind clear, star-scattered darkness, and somewhere within the stone walls of Frostmoor, two hearts that had both learned to guard themselves carefully against loss, found themselves, slowly, and without either fully choosing it, beginning to open toward each other instead. Word of the exile living within Frostmoor's walls did not stay contained for long. Court gossip moved faster than any messenger, slipping through kitchens and training yards and quiet corners of the stronghold, until it reached ears far beyond those Ronan would have chosen. By the time the first month of winter had passed, whispers followed Elena wherever she walked, curious glances and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she drew near. She tried not to let it bother her. She had survived worse than whispers. But there was something different about being watched by an entire kingdom, something that made the old, familiar ache of not belonging rise back to the surface no matter how hard she pushed it down. It was Ren who finally warned her about the visitor. "Lady Seraphine arrives within the week," Ren said one afternoon, helping Elena braid her hair back from her face in preparation for the evening meal. "She comes from the Eastfall territory, one of the largest kingdoms south of here. There has been talk of an alliance between her family and the king for years now, long before you arrived." Elena kept her expression carefully neutral, though something uncomfortable twisted low in her stomach at the news. "An alliance," she repeated, "through marriage." "That is the assumption most of the court has made," Ren said carefully, watching Elena's reflection in the small mirror propped against the wall. "Though the king has never confirmed such an arrangement himself." Elena said nothing further, though the thought lingered with her, long after Ren finished with her hair and left her alone to prepare for the evening ahead. She told herself it did not matter. She had no claim on Ronan, no right to feel the sharp, unwelcome sting of jealousy twisting through her chest at the mere mention of another wolf's name spoken alongside his. But she felt it anyway, undeniable and uninvited, and she hated how much it frightened her. Lady Seraphine arrived exactly as promised, 5 days later, sweeping into the Frostmoor stronghold, with an entourage of a dozen wolves, dressed in fine furs and gleaming jewelry, that spoke of wealth far beyond anything Elena had known, even before her exile. She was beautiful in the way that seemed almost deliberate, every movement calculated for maximum effect, her golden hair swept into an elaborate style that must have taken hours to achieve. Elena watched from the shadowed edge of the great hall, as Ronan greeted her with the formal courtesy expected of two ruling houses meeting after years apart. Seraphine's laugh carried easily across the hall, bright and practiced, her hand resting on Ronan's arm with a familiarity that made something hot and unpleasant coil in Elena's chest. "King Ronan," Seraphine said, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "It has been far too long since Eastfall and Frostmoor last spoke of stronger ties between our territories." Ronan's expression remained politely composed, though Elena, who had spent enough evenings studying his face across a quiet fire, could see the careful distance he kept, even as he returned Seraphine's greeting with practiced grace. It was the same distance he had never once kept from Elena herself, and the difference was not lost on her. Seraphine's sharp eyes found Elena across the hall, before the evening had progressed much further, and something calculating flickered briefly across her beautiful features, before smoothing into polite curiosity. "And who is this?" Seraphine asked, her tone light but pointed, drawing the attention of several nearby courtiers. "I do not believe I have had the pleasure." "Elena Voss," Ronan said simply, before Elena could answer for herself. "A guest of the Frostmoor court." "A guest," Seraphine repeated, her gaze sweeping over Elena's simple clothing, so plain compared to the fine furs and jewels surrounding them, with an assessment that felt anything but kind, despite the pleasant smile fixed on her lips. "How generous of you, my king, to extend such hospitality to wolves without a pack of their own." The insult was subtle, wrapped carefully in polite words, but Elena heard it clearly enough, and judging by the slight tightening around Ronan's eyes, so did he. "Elena has proven herself a valued presence within these walls," Ronan said, his voice carrying an edge of warning beneath its calm surface. I trust you will treat her with the respect due any guest of this court." Seraphine's smile did not falter, though something colder flickered briefly behind her eyes before she inclined her head gracefully and allowed the conversation to move elsewhere. Elena remained rooted to her spot near the wall, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude for Ronan's defense and a deep, uneasy awareness that she had just made an enemy far more dangerous than idle court gossip. The following days brought little relief. Seraphine seemed to appear wherever Elena turned, her comments always carefully polite on the surface, while carrying sharp undertones meant for Elena alone to fully understand. She spoke often and pointedly of the long history between Eastfall and Frostmoor, of childhood memories shared with Ronan before either of them had grown into their current titles, of a bond built over years that no newcomer, however interesting, could hope to match. Elena tried to remind herself that none of it should matter. She had no claim on the Alpha King, no right to feel threatened by a woman whose family had spent generations building ties with his own. But the ache in her chest grew heavier with each passing day, each polite smile Seraphine offered that felt more like a blade than a courtesy. She found Ronan one evening in the study, where they had spent so many quiet hours together, though tonight the easy warmth between them felt strained beneath the weight of everything neither had yet spoken aloud. "Your court believes you mean to marry her," Elena said finally, unable to hold the words back any longer, though she immediately wished she could take them back the moment they left her mouth. Ronan looked up from the papers spread across his desk, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "My court believes many things," he said carefully. "Not all of them are true. But some of them are," Elena pressed, hating the vulnerability in her own voice even as she could not stop herself. "An alliance between Eastfall and Frostmoor would strengthen your kingdom. It makes sense politically, in ways that whatever this is between us never could." Ronan set down his quill slowly, rising from his chair to cross the room toward her, his amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Is that truly what you believe?" he asked quietly. "Or is that simply what you fear?" Elena had no answer for that, not one she trusted herself to give, without revealing everything she had spent weeks trying to keep carefully hidden, even from herself. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer, and Ronan reached out, gently tilting her chin back, until she had no choice but to meet his eyes once more. "I have known Seraphine since we were children," he said, his voice low and steady. "I have never once felt for her what I have come to feel for you, in the short time since I pulled you from that snow. Politics may demand many things of a king, Elena, but they do not demand that I lie to you about what is real between us." Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs, hope and fear, tangled together so tightly, she could hardly separate one from the other. "And what is that?" she whispered, echoing the question she had asked him once before, in this very room, though the answer felt far more dangerous to hear now than it had then. Ronan's thumb brushed gently against her cheek, and for a moment, Elena thought he might finally say the words she had begun to hope for, however foolish that hope might prove to be. But before he could speak, a sharp knock interrupted the moment, and Callum's voice called urgently from beyond the door, carrying news that would soon pull both their attentions toward a threat neither had yet seen coming. Ronan crossed the room quickly and pulled the door open, finding Callum standing in the corridor with an expression far more grave than Elena had ever seen on the older advisor's weathered face. Behind him stood Finn, breathing hard as though he had run the entire length of the stronghold to deliver whatever news had brought him there. "Forgive the interruption, my king," Callum said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elena before returning to Ronan. "But word has reached us from the southern border. Riders were spotted crossing into Frostmoor territory before nightfall, moving with purpose toward the stronghold." "Whose riders?" Ronan asked, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant from the warmth Elena had seen only moments before, to the sharp, commanding presence of a king, preparing for danger. "Thornwood colors," Finn answered grimly. "3 of them. They did not announce themselves at the border the way honest travelers would. Our scouts nearly missed them entirely." Elena's blood ran cold at the name, old fear rising swiftly despite the weeks of safety she had known within these walls. "Thornwood," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "The day know I am here." "It seems so," Callum said, his tone carefully measured despite the tension radiating from every line of his posture. "Word of an exile finding shelter with the Frostmoor king was never going to stay contained forever, however carefully we tried to guard it. Ronan's jaw tightened, and Elena watched something dangerous flicker behind his amber eyes, a warning of the predator that lived beneath his controlled exterior. "Double the guard along the eastern wall," he ordered, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king who expected immediate obedience. "I want eyes on every entrance to this stronghold before midnight." Finn nodded sharply and disappeared down the corridor without another word, already calling out orders to nearby warriors as he went. Callum lingered a moment longer, his gaze shifting between Ronan and Elena with an expression that had softened considerably from the suspicion he had shown weeks earlier. "Whatever quarrel Thornwood believes it has with this stronghold," Callum said quietly, "they will find Frostmoor does not surrender what it has chosen to protect." Elena felt a rush of unexpected gratitude at the advisor's words, proof of how far she had come in his estimation since that first tense conversation in the stone corridor. She managed a small nod of thanks before Callum, too, took his leave, closing the door softly behind him and leaving Elena alone once more with Ronan. "They mean to take you back," Ronan said, once the silence had settled fully around them, his voice low and controlled, despite the tension radiating from his broad shoulders. "Or worse. Mira will not risk me returning to Thornwood alive," Elena said, the truth of it settling heavily in her chest, even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "As long as I live, there remains a chance the truth comes out. She cannot afford that risk, not now that her lie has already cost me everything once." Ronan crossed the room and took her hands in his grip firm and grounding, despite the fear coursing through her at the thought of Thornwood riders so close to the walls that had finally begun to feel like home. "Not now. Not ever. Unless it is on your own terms, with truth and justice standing at your side instead of exile and lies." "I do not want to bring danger to your kingdom," Elena said, guilt twisting sharply beneath her fear. "You have already given me so much. I will not ask you to risk your people, your alliances, everything you have built, simply to protect one exile," your own advisors questioned, taking in from the start. Ronan's expression softened, though the fierce determination in his eyes did not waver. "You are not simply one exile to me, Elena," he said, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. "I told you once already what I feel growing between us, even if I have not yet found the courage to name it fully aloud. Whatever danger comes for you now, comes for something I already consider mine to protect, kingdom or no kingdom, alliance or no alliance." Elena's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words, at the warmth of his hands still holding hers steady, despite the fear pressing in from every side. She wanted, desperately, to believe that whatever fragile thing had grown between them these past weeks could survive whatever Thornwood intended to bring to Frostmoor's doorstep. But old fear died hard, and old betrayal had taught her caution in ways she could not simply set aside, even for a king who had given her every reason to trust him completely. "We should prepare," she said finally, gently pulling her hands from his, though the loss of his warmth left her colder than she wanted to admit. "If Thornwood riders are truly here for me, I will not hide behind your walls and wait to see what danger unfolds. I have spent enough of my life waiting helplessly for others to decide my fate." Something like pride flickered across Ronan's features at her words, mixed with the same fierce protectiveness that had driven him out into a snowstorm weeks earlier to find a dying stranger in the woods. "Then we prepare together," he said simply, and Elena found, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest, that she believed him completely. Outside, beyond the thick stone walls of the stronghold, the wind had begun to rise again, carrying with it the first distant howls of riders, drawing closer through the darkened forest, and somewhere beneath the fear, building steadily inside her, Elena felt something else stirring as well. Not the helpless terror of a wolf abandoned in the snow, but the sharp, determined readiness of a wolf who had already survived far worse than whatever Thornwood intended to bring to her door. The attack came just before dawn, when the darkness was at its thickest, and the guards along the eastern wall had begun to feel the heavy pull of exhaustion after hours of tense watching. Elena woke to the sound of shouting, distant at first, then closer, followed by the unmistakable clash of claws against steel, echoing through the stronghold's outer gardens. She was on her feet and moving before conscious thought fully caught up with instinct, pulling on the warm clothing Wren had left within easy reach and rushing toward the door. She found Finn already waiting in the corridor outside her room, his expression tight with urgency. They breached the eastern gate, Finn said quickly, falling into step beside her as she moved. Not Thornwood riders. Not exactly. Trained fighters. Sent ahead of the main party. The king is already in the gardens. Elena's heart lurched at the thought of Ronan facing danger meant, ultimately, for her. She quickened her pace, ignoring Finn's protests that she should remain somewhere safer within the stronghold's walls, and burst out into the cold night air, just as chaos erupted fully across the frost-covered gardens. 3 figures moved with brutal efficiency through the scattered Frostmoor guards, their movements sharp and practiced in a way that spoke of wolves trained specifically for this purpose, rather than simple messengers caught in an unexpected fight. Elena recognized none of their faces, but she recognized the Thornwood markings on their clothing immediately, and cold fury replaced whatever fear had driven her from her bed. Ronan fought near the center of the garden, his massive wolf form a blur of controlled violence against 2 attackers at once, but even as Elena watched, a third figure broke away from the main fight and turned directly toward her, clearly recognizing exactly who she was despite the darkness. Elena did not hesitate. Years of training in Thornwood, weeks of renewed strength earned in Frostmoor's own yard, every lesson she had ever fought twice as hard as anyone else to learn, rose up inside her as the attacker closed the distance between them. She shifted at the last possible moment, her own wolf form smaller than her opponent's but faster, sharper, driven by a fierce refusal to ever again be the helpless creature left dying in the snow. The fight was brutal and short. Elena's opponent underestimated her, expecting the same weak, broken exile the pack had left for dead weeks earlier, and that miscalculation cost him dearly. She drove him back with a series of quick, precise strikes, using every advantage her smaller size gave her in speed and agility, until he finally stumbled, and she pinned him firmly against the frozen ground, teeth bared in a warning that needed no words to be understood. Across the garden, Ronan finished dispatching his own attackers with brutal efficiency, his massive form radiating barely restrained fury as he turned and caught sight of Elena, standing victorious over her own opponent. Something fierce and proud flashed across his face, even amid the chaos still settling around them, though it was quickly replaced by alarm as he noticed the shallow gash along her shoulder, torn open during the fight. Elena barely felt the wound in the rush of adrenaline still coursing through her, but Ronan reached her side in seconds, shifting back to human form and pulling her gently but urgently against him, his hands checking the injury with careful precision, even as his eyes scanned the garden for any further threats. "You should have stayed inside," he said, though the harshness in his voice was tempered entirely by the raw fear and relief mixing together beneath it. "I told you already," Elena said, breathing hard but steady, despite the pain now beginning to register along her shoulder. "I will not hide and wait helplessly, while others decide my fate. Not anymore." Ronan's expression shifted, something raw and unguarded breaking through the careful composure he usually maintained, even in moments of danger. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting briefly against hers, his breath ragged with an emotion far deeper than simple relief at her survival. "When I saw him moving toward you," he said quietly, his voice rough with a fear he clearly rarely allowed himself to show, "I have never in my life felt terror like that. Not in any battle I have fought, not against any enemy I have faced." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, not from the fight, but from the raw honesty in his words, the way his hands trembled slightly where they held her steady. "I am here," she said softly. "I am not going anywhere." Around them, the last of the fighting settled into tense quiet as Frostmoor guards secured the captured attackers and began clearing the garden of the chaos left behind. But neither Elena nor Ronan moved from where they stood together, his forehead still resting against hers, both finally allowing themselves to feel the full weight of how close danger had truly come that night. It was in that quiet moment, amid the settling dust of battle and the first pale light of dawn beginning to break over the eastern wall, that Ronan finally spoke the words he had been holding back for weeks, his voice steady, despite everything they had just survived together. "You are my mate, Elena," he said simply, the words carrying a weight and certainty that left no room for doubt. "I have known it since the moment I found you in that snow, though I did not yet have the courage to name it. I know it beyond any question now." Elena's breath caught, tears she had not expected rising sharply behind her eyes as the truth of his words settled into her chest, warm and undeniable, despite everything that had led them to this single, quiet moment, amid the ruins of an attack meant to destroy her. She had spent weeks fighting the same certainty inside her own heart, afraid to trust it fully, after everything betrayal had taught her. But standing here now, safe in his arms despite the danger that had so recently surrounded them both, she finally allowed herself to believe it completely. "I know it too," she whispered back, and the smile that broke across Ronan's face in response was worth every mile of cold and betrayal that had brought her, against every possible odds, to exactly this moment. The captured attacker proved reluctant to speak at first, but Callum's patient, methodical questioning eventually wore down his resistance as the morning wore on. Elena stood beside Ronan in the stronghold's lower chamber, her wound freshly bandaged by Ren's careful hands, listening, as the truth she had already suspected was confirmed in full. "Mira sent us," the captured wolf finally admitted, his eyes downcast, unwilling to meet Elena's gaze directly. "She offered payment beyond what any of us could earn through a season of hunting. She said the exile had survived only through luck, and that luck needed correcting before word of her survival reached anyone who might believe her account of what truly happened that night by the river." Elena felt a strange, hollow ache settle in her chest at hearing her sister's betrayal confirmed so plainly, spoken without hesitation by a stranger paid to end her life. Some small, foolish part of her had perhaps hoped, even after everything, that Mira's actions had been born from panic or misunderstanding, rather than cold, deliberate calculation. "She wanted me dead," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "Not simply exiled. Dead." Ronan's hand found hers, his grip steady and grounding amid the painful clarity of the moment. "She wanted the truth buried," he said grimly. "Whatever guilt or fear drives your sister now, she has made her intentions toward you unmistakably clear." Callum straightened from where he had been questioning the prisoner, his expression grave as he turned to face Ronan directly. "This changes matters considerably, my king," he said. "An attack within Frostmore's own walls, ordered by a member of a neighboring pack, is no longer simply a private grievance between an exile and her former family. It is an act of aggression against this kingdom itself." Ronan's jaw tightened, the fierce protectiveness Elena had witnessed in the garden returning sharply to his expression. "Then, it will be answered as such," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king prepared to defend what belonged to him by whatever means necessary. News of the failed attack spread through the stronghold quickly, and by midday, Elena found herself the subject of considerably different whispers than the curious, uncertain gossip that had followed her since her arrival. Now the court spoke of her with something closer to respect, tales of her swift defeat of a trained attacker circulating among the warriors who had witnessed the fight firsthand. Not everyone within the stronghold received the news with equal grace, however. Elena encountered Seraphine later that afternoon, in one of the quieter halls, the Eastfall noblewoman's expression carefully composed, but her eyes sharp with calculation, as she studied Elena's bandaged shoulder. "It seems your past has followed you here after all," Seraphine said, her tone deceptively light. "Perhaps Frostmore would be wiser to return you to Thornwood before further danger finds its way through these walls. My family has watched this kingdom's alliances carefully for generations. We would hate to see careless decisions weaken ties that have taken years to build." Elena met her gaze steadily, refusing to let the veiled threat rattle her the way it might have weeks earlier, before training and survival had reshaped her confidence into something far harder to shake. "The king has already made his decision regarding my place within this kingdom," Elena said calmly. "I would suggest, my lady, that further attempts to undermine that decision will not be received warmly." Something flickered dangerously behind Seraphine's polished exterior, brief but unmistakable, before she recovered her composure fully, and offered a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I only wish to see Frostmore's interests protected, as any true ally would." She swept past without waiting for a response, and Elena watched her go with a growing certainty that Seraphine's concerns had far less to do with Frostmore's safety, and far more to do with the growing bond between its king and the exile she had clearly hoped to see removed from the court entirely. That evening, Ronan called a private council to discuss how best to respond to Thornwood's aggression. Elena sat at his side, no longer relegated to the shadows of the Great Hall, but included directly in the conversation, shaping her own fate, for the first time since her exile began. "We cannot simply wait for further attacks," Callum said, spreading a map of the northern territories across the table between them. Thornwood has shown they are willing to cross into Frostmoor land to silence a threat to their alpha's authority. That threat will not diminish simply because this attempt failed. Then we do not wait, Ronan said, his gaze steady and resolute as it moved across the gathered council, before settling finally on Elena. We go to Thornwood ourselves, and we bring the truth with us, spoken plainly, before the entire pack, with proof strong enough that no lie can stand against it any longer. Elena's heart raced at the thought, fear and fierce determination tangling together in equal measure. To return to Thornwood, to stand before the very pack that had cast her out and nearly succeeded in ending her life twice over, felt like walking directly back into the cold she had barely survived. But something had shifted inside her since that night in the snow, something that no longer allowed fear alone to dictate her choices. I am ready, she said, and she meant it fully. For the first time since Mira's lies had first stolen her home and nearly her life. Whatever it takes to finally see the truth spoken and believed, I am ready to face it. Ronan's hand found hers beneath the table, steady and warm, a silent promise that she would not face whatever came next alone. And around them, the council began the careful work of preparing for a confrontation that would, within days, finally bring Elena's long fight for justice to its inevitable conclusion. The journey toward Thornwood territory took 3 full days, the Frostmoor party moving swiftly through the snow-covered wilderness that separated the two kingdoms. Ronan rode at the front of a small but formidable escort, warriors chosen carefully for their loyalty and skill rather than sheer numbers, while Elena remained close at his side, retracing a path she had once walked in chains of shame and fear, now walking it instead as a wolf with a king beside her and truth as her shield. Memories rose sharply with every familiar landmark they passed, the twisted oak where she had played as a pup, the frozen stream where she had first learned to hunt alongside her sister, before jealousy poisoned everything gentle that had once existed between them. Elena forced herself to breathe through the tightness in her chest, reminding herself with every step that she was no longer the frightened, broken wolf who had crawled through this same snow believing her life was already over. You are quiet, Ronan observed on the final evening before they would reach Thornwood's borders, his voice low as they sat together near the fire their party had made camp around. I am remembering, Elena admitted. This land holds more history for me than simple geography. I grew up believing I understood who I was within these borders. Discovering how quickly that understanding could be destroyed changed something in me I am not certain will ever fully heal. Ronan's arms settled around her shoulders, warm and steady against the cold night air. Whatever Thornwood took from you, he said quietly, they cannot take what you have built since. Your strength, your resilience, whatever bond has grown between us, those are yours now, regardless of what happens tomorrow. Elena leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his certainty, even as her own nerves twisted tighter with every passing hour. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring her face to face with everyone who had once condemned her without a trial, without mercy, without a single moment's consideration for the truth she had been screaming into the snow as they walked away and left her to die. They reached the outer boundary of Thornwood territory just past dawn, and word of their arrival spread through the packlands with startling speed. By the time Ronan's party approached the central gathering grounds, where Thornwood held its most important assemblies, a crowd had already begun to form, whispers rippling through the gathered wolves, as recognition dawned across faces Elena had once considered family. The Thornwood Alpha, Garrick Thorn, emerged from his own stronghold flanked by several senior pack members, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm, as he took in the sight of a Frostmoor delegation, standing boldly on his own territory, with the exile he had ordered left for dead, standing very much alive, at the Frostmoor king's side. King Ronan, Garrick said carefully, his voice carrying the forced calm of someone attempting to mask genuine unease. This is an unexpected visit. What business brings Frostmoor to Thornwood lands? Justice, Ronan said simply, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd with the natural authority of a king accustomed to commanding attention. 3 months ago, your pack condemned a wolf to exile and death based on a lie. That lie nearly succeeded twice now, once in the snow at your own border, and again within the walls of my own stronghold, where your pack sent trained assassins to finish what your exile order began. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the assembled crowd, and Elena watched Garrick's expression falter, genuine surprise flickering across his features that suggested, perhaps, he had not known the full extent of what had been done in his name. "These are serious accusations," Garrick said slowly, his eyes darting toward someone standing near the edge of the crowd, and Elena followed his gaze to find her sister Mira standing frozen among the pack members, her face draining of color as recognition and dawning panic replaced whatever composure she had walked out expecting to need that morning. "They are more than accusations," Ronan said, gesturing toward one of his warriors, who stepped forward leading the captured attacker from their party's ranks, bound and clearly recognizable to several members of the Thornwood crowd. "This wolf will confirm, before your entire pack, exactly who paid for Elena Voss's death, and why." Elena watched her sister's composure crumble in real time, as the captured attacker, prompted by Callum's steady questioning, repeated before the gathered crowd exactly what he had already confessed, within Frostmore's walls. Every word landed like a blow, and Elena felt something long buried finally begin to loosen inside her chest, watching the truth she had screamed uselessly into the snow months earlier, finally being heard. "Mira," Garrick said, turning slowly toward the sister Elena had once trusted more than anyone, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that had not been present moments before. "Is this true?" Mira's eyes darted wildly between the Alpha, the captured assassin, and Elena herself, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering entirely under the weight of exposure. "I only wanted what was rightfully mine," she said, her voice breaking, all pretense of grief and righteous accusation stripped away to reveal the raw, ugly jealousy that had driven every lie from the very beginning. "Elena was always favored, always chosen. I deserved my own chance to matter, and she stood in my way simply by existing." The crowd's murmurs turned sharply hostile, shock giving way rapidly to anger, as the full scope of Mira's betrayal became clear before the entire pack's eyes. Elena stood silently amid the unfolding chaos, watching years of buried resentment finally spill out into the open, feeling something complicated settle inside her chest. Not quite triumph, not quite grief, but something that finally, after months of carrying an injustice no one would acknowledge, resembled relief. Garrick stood motionless for a long moment, the weight of his own failure settling visibly across his shoulders, as he faced the wreckage of a decision he had made, without ever seeking the truth he should have demanded from the very beginning. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the authority he had commanded moments earlier, replaced instead by something heavy with shame. "I acted without proper investigation," he said, addressing the crowd as much as he addressed Elena and Ronan directly. "I allowed grief and fear to guide a decision that should have demanded far more care than I gave it. Elena Voss, I failed you as your alpha. I failed the trust this pack placed in my judgment. There is no excuse I can offer that will undo the harm already done." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the sincerity behind his words, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed him. Whatever failure had led him to condemn her so quickly, she did not sense the same calculated cruelty in him that had driven her sister's actions. He had been careless, blinded by fear and convenience, but not deliberately malicious in the way Mira had proven herself to be. "What happens to Mira now falls to your judgment as Alpha," Ronan said, his tone leaving no doubt that Frostmore considered the matter of Thornwood's internal justice to remain within Garrick's authority, even as the larger matter of aggression against his own kingdom would require separate resolution. "But know this clearly. Elena Voss stands under Frostmore's protection now, and any further attempt against her safety will be answered as an act of war between our kingdoms." Garrick nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the warning fully. "It will not happen again," he said. "You have my word, for whatever it is worth after today." Mira was led away by Thornwood's own guards, her earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by desperate pleading that fell on ears no longer willing to listen. Elena watched her sister disappear from view for what she suspected would be the last time, and felt, beneath the complicated tangle of emotions still swirling through her chest, a strange and unexpected sense of closure finally settling into place. The elder who had once believed in Elena's potential as a future leader, frail but recovered enough now to attend the gathering, made his way slowly through the dispersing crowd until he stood before her, his eyes bright with tears he did not bother hiding. "I should have fought harder for you," he said, his voice trembling with age and regret. I was too weak, too slow to recover, and by the time I found my strength again, you were already gone into the snow." Elena reached out and took his weathered hands gently in her own, old grief and old affection mixing together as she looked into the face of the one person in Thornwood who had always, without exception, believed in what she might become. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said softly. "You taught me everything that helped me survive what came after. That gift was never diminished by what happened to me, no matter how far from here I ended up traveling." As the gathering slowly dispersed, Garrick approached once more, his expression uncertain but sincere. "Thornwood owes you a debt it cannot easily repay," he said. "If you wish to return, to reclaim your place within this pack, that door remains open to you, whatever authority I still hold to offer it." Elena considered the offer carefully, feeling the weight of it settle against everything she had built and lost and rebuilt again over these past difficult months. Once, such an offer would have meant everything to her, a chance to reclaim the home and family she had been so brutally torn away from. But standing here now, with Ronan's steady presence beside her, and the memory of everything Frostmore had given her when Thornwood offered nothing but betrayal, she found the answer came to her with surprising ease. "Thornwood was my home once," she said gently, without cruelty, but without hesitation either. "But it stopped being my home the moment it chose convenience over truth, fear over loyalty. I have found somewhere new to belong since then, somewhere that never once asked me to prove my worth before offering me safety." Garrick nodded slowly, understanding evident in his weary expression, and offered no further argument against her choice. As the Frostmore party finally turned to begin their journey home, Elena cast one last look back at the packlands that had shaped her earliest years, feeling not the crushing grief she had expected, but instead a quiet, settled peace, the kind that comes only from finally closing a chapter that had been left painfully, dangerously open for far too long. Beside her, Ronan reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, with the easy familiarity of two people who had already weathered far more together than most bonds ever faced in a lifetime. "Ready to go home?" he asked quietly. Elena looked ahead, toward the northern horizon where Frostmore's stone towers waited beyond miles of snow-covered wilderness, and felt her heart settle fully into the truth of her own answer. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." The return journey to Frostmore felt entirely different from the tense, uncertain path that had carried them toward Thornwood only days earlier. Elena rode beside Ronan with a lightness in her chest she had not known since long before her exile. The weight of unresolved injustice finally lifted after months of carrying it alone through the cold. News of what had happened at Thornwood traveled quickly, reaching the Frostmore stronghold well before their party did, and Elena found herself greeted upon arrival, not with the curious, cautious glances she had grown used to, but with something far warmer. Warriors she had trained alongside in the yard called out welcomes as she passed. Even Callum, who had once studied her with open suspicion, offered a respectful bow that spoke volumes about how far she had come in his estimation. Ren met her at the stronghold entrance with tears in her eyes and a fierce embrace that Elena returned gladly, grateful beyond words for the friendship this healer had offered her from the very first morning of her recovery. "You look different," Ren said, pulling back to study Elena's face carefully. "Lighter, somehow." "I feel lighter," Elena admitted, and meant it completely. The days that followed brought a kind of peace Elena had never expected to find again after the devastation of her exile. She continued training in the yard each morning, her skill and confidence growing with every session, until few among Frostmore's warriors could claim an easy victory against her. She spent afternoons learning the deeper workings of the kingdom that had become her home, and evenings, always, with Ronan, the bond between them deepening with each passing day into something neither felt any need to hide or question any longer. It was nearly a month after their return from Thornwood, on an evening when the first gentle signs of an early spring had begun to soften winter's harsh grip on the northern territories, that Ronan led Elena out onto the stronghold's highest terrace, overlooking the vast, snow-dusted kingdom spread out beneath the darkening sky. "I have ruled Frostmore alone for many years," he said, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him, even in their most private moments together. "I built this kingdom's strength believing I needed nothing more than duty and discipline to guide it well. I did not understand, until the night I found you dying in the snow, how much I had been missing all along." Elena's heart raced, hardly daring to hope for the words she sensed building behind his careful pause, though the warmth in his amber eyes told her clearly enough what was coming. "Elena Voss," Ronan continued, reaching for both her hands and holding them steady between his own. "You came to me with nothing. No pack, no name that carried anything but shame you never deserved. And yet you have given this kingdom, and given me, more than I ever imagined possible. I do not simply wish for you to remain here as my mate in name alone. I wish for you to rule beside me, fully and completely, as my queen." Tears rose freely in Elena's eyes now, all the careful composure she had built over months of survival, finally giving way entirely to the overwhelming joy of this single, perfect moment. She thought of the frightened, freezing wolf who had once believed her life was ending in the snow, who could never have imagined a future holding anything close to this. "Yes," she said, the word carrying every ounce of certainty she felt in her heart. "Yes, Ronan, I will rule beside you, gladly, for as long as you will have me." The kingdom celebrated their union with a ceremony that drew wolves from territories across the northern lands, a grand affair held beneath a sky finally clear of winter's heaviest storms, sunlight glinting brilliantly off snow that no longer felt like the enemy that had once nearly claimed Elena's life. She stood before the gathered crowd in fine furs of deep blue, Ronan at her side, and felt not a trace of the fear or shame that had once defined every moment of her existence within Thornwood's borders. When the pack elder who had performed the ceremony finally pronounced her Queen of Frostmoor, a great howl rose up from the assembled crowd, warriors and courtiers alike lifting their voices together in celebration of the bond now sealed between their king and the wolf who had arrived among them with nothing but survival instinct and an unshakable refusal to be broken. Elena caught sight of Wren in the crowd, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, and Finn standing proudly nearby, and even Callum, offering the smallest, most genuine smile she had ever seen cross his weathered features. Every face turned toward her now held nothing but warmth, nothing but acceptance freely given, rather than painstakingly earned. She thought, briefly, of the pack that had left her to die in the snow, of the sister whose jealousy had nearly cost her everything, of the long, agonizing months of exile and fear that had once felt as though they would never end. But those memories no longer held the power to wound her the way they once had. They had simply become part of the story that led her here, to this moment, standing beside a king who had chosen to see her worth long before she had learned to see it fully in herself. Ronan turned to her as the celebration continued around them, his amber eyes warm with a love that had grown slowly and steadily from that very first night in the snow into something neither time, nor danger, nor betrayal had managed to diminish. He drew her close, resting his forehead gently against hers, the way he had once done amid the chaos of battle, though tonight held nothing but peace and promise between them. "I told you once that I would find whoever hurt you," he murmured, "and that they would answer for it. I did not know then that the greatest answer of all would be watching you become everything your own pack was too blind to ever recognize." Elena smiled, feeling the last remnants of old grief finally settle into something gentler, something that no longer ached but simply remembered. "I was cast out to die in the snow," she said softly, echoing back to the very beginning of everything that had brought them here. "But you found me first. And I will keep finding you," Ronan promised, "every single day, for as long as we both shall live." Above them, the northern sky stretched clear and endless, and beneath it, the kingdom of Frostmoor stood stronger than it ever had before, guided now by a king who had once ruled through duty alone, and a queen who had learned that even the coldest exile could, against every possible odds, find her way home.